The rains had ended, and a cool breeze carried the scent of fresh earth across the sprawling estate of Chief Ogedegbe. It was a celebration day. 2 tents were pitched in the yard, vibrant cloths of blue and gold were strung from posts, and the air rang with music from the village drummers. The laughter of guests mixed with the rhythmic sound of the talking drum, creating an atmosphere that felt joyous, almost ethereal. Chief Ogedegbe stood in the midst of it all, watching the festivities, but his eyes kept finding their way back to the table where his 2 daughters sat. Adaora and Ijeoma, just 1 year old, were the centerpieces of this celebration. They were his pride, the future of all he had built. He watched Adaora, her little hands clapping to the rhythm of the drum. Her eyes were bright, and she laughed freely, her tiny face lighting up every time the crowd cheered. Beside her sat Ijeoma, who was fussing in her mother's lap. She was crying, her face flushed, her cries growing louder as the music increased in tempo. Chief Ogedegbe's gaze lingered, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Why does she always have to cry?" he murmured to himself, frustration seeping into his voice. His wife, Amoka, looked at him from across the table, as if she had heard the unspoken words in his heart. She rocked Ijeoma gently, shushing her with whispered comfort, but Chief Ogedegbe's gaze had already shifted back to Adaora. As the drums faded and the cake was brought out, Chief Ogedegbe leaned towards Amoka and whispered, "Adaora will be the one. She has the heart for it." Amoka frowned, holding Ijeoma closer, almost as if shielding her. "They are both your daughters, Ogedegbe. They are both deserving of your love." But Ogedegbe had already made up his mind. He did not answer. Instead, he reached over to take Adaora's tiny hand, his heart swelling with pride. He was going to mold her, guide her, and make her everything he believed an heir should be. As for Ijeoma, well, he had no plans for her. Little did he know that his cold choice, made on a sunny day of celebration, would grow into a shadow that haunted his family for years to come. The twins grew, but they grew apart. By the time Adaora and Ijeoma were 10, their worlds could not have been more different. Adaora was often seen at her father's side. She would sit beside him during his meetings, her small face peering over the table as he conducted business with an air of command that mesmerized her. She watched as he made deals, his words sharp yet persuasive, bending the wheels of even the most stubborn businessmen. The offices of Ogedegbe Holdings became her playground, filled with shiny calculators, graphs, and rows of men and women in dark suits who always greeted her warmly. "Look at you, Adaora," her father often said, patting her head. "One day, you will sit at this table, and all these people will answer to you." Adaora would nod solemnly, already carrying herself with the poise and confidence of someone who had the world promised to her. Meanwhile, Ijeoma lived a life of exclusion. When her father left for work, taking Adaora with him, she would linger by the gate, watching until their car disappeared down the long driveway. Her mother, Amoka, would call her back inside, handing her storybooks or involving her in household chores. "Do not worry, my dear," Amoka would say, her smile warm but tinged with sadness. "You do not need to be in those stuffy offices to know your worth. Your strength is different." But to a child who only saw her sister getting all the attention, her mother's words were a hollow comfort. Ijeoma longed for the moments Adaora shared with their father, the laughter, the whispered secrets, the pride in his eyes that was always for her sister, but never for her. She started to resent being hidden away in the background, feeling like she was invisible. One day, after her father and sister had left for another business event, Ijeoma sat on the veranda with her uncle, Nnamdi, her mother's brother. He was the only one who seemed to understand her pain without words. "Why can't I be like Adaora, Uncle Nnamdi?" she asked, her eyes filled with tears. Uncle Nnamdi looked at her for a long time before replying. Ijeoma, my dear, there is a power in being overlooked. People never see you coming, and when you rise, they are forced to see you for who you truly are. What do you mean? Ijeoma wiped her eyes, curiosity overriding her sadness. Your father has a narrow vision, Ijeoma, he said, tapping her forehead lightly. He believes success looks one way, his way. But you, my child, have a fire within you, and one day, that fire will become so bright that no one can ignore it. His words stayed with her. They were the first seed of hope planted in her heart, a hope that one day she would prove herself to her father, that her worth was more than the quiet shadow he forced her into. It was a humid evening, the air thick with the scent of hibiscus and earth, as Chief Ogedegbe threw a lavish party to celebrate Adaora's acceptance into an exclusive international business program. The backyard of their estate was decorated with shimmering lights, and the entire business elite of Lagos seemed to be present. Adaora stood at the center of it all, wearing a deep blue lace dress that accentuated her elegance. She smiled politely as men and women congratulated her, each handshake accompanied by lavish praise for her father's chosen heir. Ijeoma stood in the shadows near the buffet table, feeling her heart sink with each compliment that came her sister's way. She wore a simple Ankara gown, one that her mother had made her, but it felt dull in comparison to the richness of Adaora's attire. Just as she was about to step away, she overheard her father talking to one of his business associates. His voice carried above the din, full of pride and laughter. Oh, Adaora is the future. She has the brains, the drive, everything Ijeoma does not. A shame, truly, but at least one of them is worth 10 daughters. The words echoed through Ijeoma, sharp as shards of glass. Her fingers trembled, and tears blurred her vision. She didn't wait to hear more. She turned and walked away, each step faster than the last until she was running away from the party, from her father's words, from the crushing realization that no matter what she did, she would never be enough for him. By the time she reached her room, her face was wet with tears. She collapsed onto her bed, sobs racking her body. But in the midst of her sorrow, something shifted. Her uncle's words came back to her. There is a power in being overlooked. Wiping her tears, Ijeoma sat up. She pulled out a notebook from her drawer, the one her uncle had given her years ago, and began to write. She jotted down ideas, scribbled drawings, everything she could think of. Her uncle had once told her stories about his business, a small shop he had owned where he sold handmade crafts. She remembered how passionate he had been, how he would show her his latest creation with pride. Ijeoma decided that night that she would forge her own path, away from her father's expectations. She would prove her worth, not by becoming Adaora, but by being herself. Adaora's departure for the prestigious business program was a grand affair. Chief Ogedegbe personally drove her to the airport, along with a convoy of family and well-wishers. They hugged, laughed, and took photos, with Chief Ogedegbe giving Adaora last-minute advice about networking and remembering her roots. It was a proud moment for him, and Adaora wore that pride like an expensive perfume. Back home, Ijeoma remained. She enrolled at a local university, choosing to study fashion and business, a path that seemed strange to most of her peers, who couldn't understand why the daughter of a business mogul would be interested in textiles rather than taking over her father's empire. She threw herself into her studies, her passion for fashion driven by her memories of Uncle Nnamdi and the small shop he used to run. She found inspiration in Nigeria's rich cultural heritage, Yoruba Oso-oak fabrics, Igbo traditional embroidery, and the bold patterns of Hausa designs. She combined these elements with her own sense of style, creating pieces that told a story of both past and future, of identity and pride. To support herself, she set up a modest stall at the Lagos market. She stitched clothes at night, often with her mother beside her, the hum of the sewing machine a constant soundtrack to her dreams. It was exhausting work, lugging her designs through the crowded streets, negotiating with vendors, trying to convince skeptical customers of the value of her pieces. But slowly, people began to notice her. Her designs were unique, unlike anything else at the market. They weren't just clothes, they were wearable stories, embroidered with meaning. People loved that. They loved the way she could explain each stitch, each symbol, and soon, her store started to gain a reputation. Her father, however, remained indifferent. To him, what Ijeoma did was no more than a hobby. He never asked about her business, and when she mentioned it in passing, he simply nodded before changing the topic to something Adaora had accomplished. Yet despite his indifference, Ijeoma pushed on, driven by a desire that was as much about proving her father wrong as it was about finding herself. Ijeoma's break came when she was contacted by Mr. Alobi, a high-profile investor in Lagos. He had seen her designs at a local fashion showcase and wanted to discuss a partnership. He spoke grandly of taking her brand beyond Nigeria, introducing her work to the international market, creating a luxury line that would appeal to the global elite. Ijeoma could hardly believe her luck. She worked tirelessly on her pitch, putting together samples, branding, a financial plan, all the things her university classes had taught her. The night before her meeting, she barely slept, running through her presentation, adjusting details, making sure everything was perfect. The day of the meeting, she entered Mr. Alobi's office with hope swelling in her heart. She laid out her work, explaining her vision, her passion, how each design represented a piece of Nigerian history and culture. But as she spoke, Mr. Alobi's interest seemed to dwindle. He glanced at his phone, tapped his fingers, barely looking at her samples. After she finished, he sighed and said, "Look, Ijeoma, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this isn't going to work for the market I have in mind. It's too niche, too traditional. People want something modern." Ijeoma tried to argue, tried to explain how tradition and modernity could coexist, but Mr. Alobi was already shaking his head. "I spoke to your father," he said, as if that settled the matter. "And he thinks your work is unsustainable." The words were like a punch to the gut. She felt her breath catch, her cheeks flush with humiliation. Her father, he had spoken to her father. And of course, her father had undermined her, probably without a second thought. She left the office with her samples tucked under her arm, her eyes burning with unshed tears. She felt foolish, like a child who had tried to join the grown-ups table only to be sent away. But that evening, as she sat with her mother, she realized that she couldn't give up, not now, not ever. This was her dream, her fight, and she would see it through, with or without her father's approval. Sitting in her workshop late one night, Ijeoma thought of her Uncle Nnamdi again, of the pride he had in his small business, in the way he connected with people. That was what she needed now, not the cold disinterest of an investor like Mr. Alobi, but someone who believed in her. She found herself dialing the number of Mr. Afolabi, her uncle's old friend. He was a retired entrepreneur who had once helped Uncle Nnamdi with his craft business. Ijeoma remembered him as a kind man, someone who was always ready to offer advice to those in need. "Mr. Afolabi," she said when he answered, her voice trembling, "I need your help." She explained everything, the dream, the rejection, the struggle. He listened quietly, and when she finished, he simply said, "Come see me tomorrow." The next day, she visited his modest home. Mr. Afolabi was older than she remembered, his hair graying, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. He looked through her designs, listening as she talked, his face giving nothing away. After a long while, he smiled. "Your uncle always said you had fire, Ijeoma. and I see it now. I don't have much, but what I have, I will give to you. Not because I believe in your father's empire, but because I believe in you. He gave her a small loan, but more than that, he gave her his mentorship. Mr. Afolabi had seen the ups and downs of business, the highs of success and the crushing lows of failure. He guided Ijeoma, teaching her how to navigate the complexities of the market, how to manage her finances, and most importantly, how to hold on to her integrity when everything else seemed to slip away. With his help, Ijeoma's business started to flourish again. She moved from a small market stall to a proper workshop, hired a few assistants, and began to expand her line. Her brand, Ije Threads, began to gain recognition, not just for its beauty, but for its authenticity. Her father still didn't acknowledge her achievements, but the world began to see her. And for Ijeoma, that was enough. The transformation of Ije Threads from a modest stall to a burgeoning brand was nothing short of miraculous, but it was the product of countless sleepless nights, an unwavering belief in herself, and the unwavering support of her community. By now, Ijeoma had hired a team of skilled women, artisans from different parts of Nigeria. These women came from various tribes and walks of life, each bringing their own unique skills to the embroidery and sewing of the garments. The workshop was a small but bustling place, nestled between two larger warehouses in the heart of Lagos. There was always music playing, sometimes Igbo highlife, other times Hausa drumming or Yoruba praise songs. It was a place of unity, a melting pot of culture, where each garment was a collaborative effort, stitched with care and dedication. The walls were adorned with sketches of new designs, fabric samples hung in long colorful swaths, and the smell of freshly dyed textiles mixed with the earthy scent of the courtyard. Ijeoma believed in paying her workers fairly, in creating a community where everyone felt valued, unlike the impersonal corporate environment her father ran. She was inspired by her uncle's philosophy, and she made sure her workers knew their worth and understood the importance of their craft. One day, during a meeting with the team, Ijeoma presented her idea of expanding their product range beyond clothing to include accessories, home decor, and even hosting workshops to teach traditional embroidery techniques. She wanted to share the rich heritage she had learned from her uncle to educate others on the beauty and significance behind every stitch. "People want authenticity," she said, her voice ringing with passion as she addressed her team. "They want something real, something that connects them to their roots. We are not just making clothes, we are telling our stories." Her team cheered, inspired by her vision. It wasn't long before her efforts started to gain traction. Social media became her ally, bloggers and influencers began posting about her designs, praising her not just for her creativity but for the cultural narrative she wove into each piece. Soon, Ije Threads was no longer just a local market stall, it was a recognized brand, gaining attention from international buyers looking for something unique and meaningful. But with success came new challenges. The demand for her designs grew faster than her capacity to produce them, and Ijeoma faced a dilemma. She could either scale up, risking the loss of her brand's authenticity, or find a way to maintain her craftsmanship on a larger scale. It was during these difficult times that she leaned heavily on the lessons she had learned from Mr. Afolabi, lessons about maintaining her core values even in the face of expansion. Meanwhile, across town, the empire Chief Ogedegbe had built was beginning to show cracks. Ogedegbe Holdings had been a powerhouse for decades, but the world was changing faster than the chief could adapt. He still held on to old methods, preferring traditional real estate deals and undervaluing the rise of digital technology and the new economy. He was resistant to change, believing that his name and influence were enough to keep him at the top. However, trouble started brewing when one of his key international investments, a property development project in South Africa, fell through due to political instability and poor management. The failure of this project triggered a ripple effect, causing shareholders to panic and the company's value to plummet. The boardroom, once filled with Ogedegbe's loyalists, began to see dissent. Members whispered behind closed doors, questioning whether the chief was still capable of leading them. Adaora, having returned from her business studies abroad, took up the mantle of trying to salvage the company. She was determined to prove herself, to be the daughter her father could continue to be proud of. But the situation was more precarious than she had anticipated. Her education had prepared her for challenges, but nothing like the real-world crisis she now faced. The weight of her father's expectations was heavy, and the walls of the boardroom that once made her feel powerful now seemed to be closing in on her. It wasn't long before whispers turned into action. Mr. Okoro, a rival businessman who had envied Ogedegbe's success for years, saw an opportunity. He began buying up shares through proxies, offering panicked shareholders prices they couldn't refuse. He was a shark, circling the wounded prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. The takeover wasn't just about business for Okoro, it was personal. He had always resented Chief Ogedegbe's arrogance, his belief that he was untouchable. The situation reached a boiling point when Adaora, after weeks of failed attempts to secure funding and stabilize the company, finally realized that they couldn't do it alone. She came home one evening, her face pale and eyes sunken with exhaustion, and found her father sitting in his study. He looked older than she remembered, his shoulders slumped, the confidence gone from his eyes. "Father," Adaora began, her voice almost breaking, "we need help. We can't fight this alone." Chief Ogedegbe looked up at his daughter, his face lined with stress. "And who will help us, Adaora?" "Who?" The answer hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. Ijeoma was at her workshop when Adaora walked in. The sight of her sister standing at the door was enough to make her pause. Adaora rarely came to this side of Lagos, and when she did, it was never without reason. Adaora looked out of place in the workshop, her fitted business suit starkly contrasting with the colorful, bustling surroundings. Her eyes darted nervously around as Ijeoma's workers glanced at her, whispering among themselves. Ijeoma approached, her heart pounding, unsure of what this unexpected visit meant. "What brings you here, Adaora?" Ijeoma asked, keeping her tone neutral, though her curiosity was piqued. Adaora hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Ijeoma, we need your help. Father's company is in trouble. There's a hostile takeover happening, and he needs you." For a moment, Ijeoma just stared at her sister, the words hanging in the air between them like an unfulfilled promise. Her heart twisted with a mix of emotions, anger, resentment, vindication, and something else, something she didn't want to acknowledge. Was it pity? Compassion? She wasn't sure. "You need me," Ijeoma repeated, her voice thick with incredulity. "The same father who never believed in me, who never once thought I was worth anything." Adaora's eyes welled with tears, her composure crumbling. "I know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know he was wrong. I know we both were. But this is our family, Ijeoma. It's everything he's worked for, and without your help, we'll lose it all." Ijeoma's mind raced. Part of her wanted to refuse, to turn her back on the father who had always turned his back on her. But another part of her, the part shaped by her mother's compassion, her uncle's belief in her, and her own deep-seated sense of duty, couldn't ignore the plea in her sister's eyes. There was also her mother to think of. Amoka had always tried to keep the family together, always tried to bridge the gap between the two sisters, even when the divide seemed impossible to cross. Ijeoma knew how much this would mean to her mother, how much it would mean to finally bring healing to their fractured family. After a long silence, Ijeoma finally nodded, her expression hardening with resolve. "I will help you," she said, her voice steady. "But on my terms. I want public acknowledgement from father that I'm the rightful heir to the company. I want him to admit that I have earned my place and that I am capable of leading. Adaora's relief was palpable, and she nodded eagerly. Yes, anything, Ijeoma. I'll make sure of it. It was a strange feeling, walking into Ogedegbe Holdings for the first time in years. The last time Ijeoma had been there, she was a young girl, following her father with hope in her eyes, hoping for a moment of recognition. Now she was returning, not as the forgotten daughter, but as a savior. The office was exactly as she remembered, grand, impersonal, filled with people who wore suits like armor. The employees stared as she walked past, some whispering her name, others looking on with curiosity. She could hear snippets of their conversations, people speculating about what she was doing there, why the chief's estranged daughter had returned. In the boardroom, her father sat at the head of the long table, his face drawn, his eyes hollow. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment, Ijeoma thought she saw something like regret flash in his eyes. Ijeoma, he said, his voice barely a whisper. She stood before him, her back straight, her chin held high. Father, I will help save this company, but I have conditions. Chief Ogedegbe nodded, already knowing what was coming. I understand, he said, his voice hoarse. I will make the announcement. You will lead us through this. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was the closest he had ever come to acknowledging his mistakes. And for now, it was enough. A press conference was called the next day. Cameras flashed as Chief Ogedegbe stood before the gathered journalists, Adaora and Ijeoma by his side. He cleared his throat, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the microphone. I stand here today to introduce you to the new face of Ogedegbe Holdings, he began, his voice thick with emotion. My daughter, Ijeoma, has proven herself beyond doubt. She has built something remarkable, something far greater than I could have imagined. And now, she will lead this company, as she was always meant to. The words felt like a release, a burden being lifted, not just from Chief Ogedegbe but from the entire family. For the first time in her life, Ijeoma heard her father speak of her with pride, and though it came late, it still filled a hollow place in her heart that she had long since thought was beyond healing. The following weeks were the most intense of Ijeoma's life. She threw herself into the fight, strategizing day and night to stave off Mr. Okoro's advances. Unlike her father, Ijeoma understood the power of transparency, the importance of community trust, and the leverage she had with the public's perception of her as an underdog, a self-made woman standing up for her family's legacy. She held meetings with the board members, convincing them of her vision, showing them a future that wasn't just about making profits but about creating something that mattered, something that could make a difference. Her honesty, her passion, and her knowledge won over even the most skeptical of board members, many of whom had long doubted Chief Ogedegbe's old-fashioned methods. Mr. Okoro, of course, did not back down easily. He launched a smear campaign, trying to paint Ijeoma as inexperienced, accusing her of being an opportunist trying to use her family name to her advantage. But Ijeoma countered each attack with integrity. She appeared on interviews, talking openly about her journey, about her vision for Ogedegbe Holdings and how she wanted to reshape it into a company that could benefit not only the shareholders but the community as a whole. People rallied behind her. They saw in her the hope of something new, something different. Investors who had once backed out reconsidered, choosing to put their faith in her. Shareholders who had been ready to sell to Okoro began to change their minds, convinced by Ijeoma's sincerity and determination. It was a grueling battle, and there were moments when Ijeoma doubted herself, moments when the exhaustion seemed too much to bear. But every time she faltered, she remembered her mother's comforting voice, her uncle's encouragement, and the eyes of the women in her workshop, all counting on her to succeed. She had come too far, fought too hard to give up now. The day that Mr. Okoro finally withdrew his hostile takeover bid was a day of celebration across Ogedegbe Holdings. The employees cheered, board members shook Ijeoma's hand with respect, and even Adaora, who had once been her rival, embraced her sister, tears in her eyes. "You did it, Ijeoma," Adaora whispered. "You saved us." Ijeoma smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in years. "We did it, Adaora. Together." Later that evening, Chief Ogedegbe called Ijeoma into his study. He looked smaller somehow, his once imposing figure now just an old man who had finally seen the error of his ways. He reached out, his hand trembling, and took Ijeoma's hand in his. "I was wrong," he said, his voice breaking. "I thought strength was about power, about control. But your strength comes from love, from resilience. You have taught me more than I ever taught you." For the first time in her life, Ijeoma saw her father cry, and she felt a deep sense of release. She stepped forward, embracing him, feeling the weight of years of pain and rejection finally lifting. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, the wounds of the past could never fully disappear, but it was a start. And that was enough. In the weeks that followed, Ijeoma took over as CEO of Ogedegbe Holdings, but she did it on her own terms. She brought in new people, implemented new policies that focused on community engagement and sustainable growth. Adaora found her place as well, working alongside her sister but focusing on areas where her strengths lay: marketing, international outreach, and expanding the company's brand in a positive way. Together, they built something that wasn't just about wealth, but about legacy, about making a difference in the lives of others. Ijeoma continued to run Threads as a subsidiary, merging her vision of cultural heritage with the corporate world her father had once dominated. The family was far from perfect, but they were healing. And in the end, that was the real victory. And so, the story of Chief Ogedegbe and his twin daughters became a tale retold in households across Nigeria, a story about ambition, resilience, and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. It became a reminder that greatness isn't something handed down through inheritance, it is something earned, sometimes through the struggle of the one least expected to succeed. It was, at its heart, an African folktale, a story of overcoming adversity, of community, of a daughter who rose against all odds to build a legacy that was stronger and more enduring than anything that had come before.